Chapter 20. The Final Showdown. Whilst those in the land of the lonely prepared for a potential attack, Trezon boiled with anger. First had come the loss of Neuro, then the return of the Sugar Fairy's health, and now the brutal attack on his beloved Riboltians and the freedom of those pathetic Kulabus and Lentinas. He was so overcome with rage and hunger for revenge that he set off immediately for the land of the lonely. Given that his flaxen bird form was light and his tainted wand, Evuli, was very powerful, he estimated that he could comfortably make the trip in about 12 hours, without tiring Evuli. She would need to be fresh for the main event. The Broodwood wand would first teleport them to Smelter 13 on Barren Mountain. She would only be afforded 5 hours rest before being required to teleport them to Brother 5 of the 5 brothers. She would then have a further 5 hours rest before delivering them to the outskirts of the land of the lonely. Trezon's flaxen form would then fly him towards the town centre. If all went according to plan, he should arrive in the town centre well before sunrise. This would allow him to mount his attack whilst the friendlies and their allies were in deep sleep and totally defenceless. As Trezon arrived at Smelter 13, the golden heart on Willowwood's sacred Elquidian medallion started to beat considerably quicker. He immediately informed Dementia of this change. The aging wizard now knew that Trezon was on the march, and drawing ever closer. He prayed that the Doolan dragons and their passengers would get here before Trezon did. They would require as much help as possible. Whilst Evuli slept, Trezon surveyed Barren Mountain. His flaxen bird form allowed him to get an aerial view of his surrounds. He spotted nothing curious or spectacular, until he came upon the sparkling black Sugar Fairy leotard. Its discovery left him completely baffled. Instead of rehearsing his plan or resting, he spent wasteful hours focusing on why it was black, who it belonged to, and how it may have got here. It was just as well that he didn't discover Dementia's discarded right thumb. That would have thrown him into a real spin. When Trezon arrived at the apex of Brother 5, 5 hours later, he discovered 2 more of these black Sugar Fairy leotards. He was now more confused than ever. He desperately wanted to understand why they were turning up all over the place. Did their presence hold any significance? Was their black colouring some sort of omen? He was very superstitious. Solving this mystery had now become an all-consuming obsession for him. Yet again, this baffling mystery kept him from resting or rehearsing his plan. His arrival on Brother 5 also caused Willowwood's golden heart to beat even quicker. Dementia knew that an attack was now imminent. He therefore breathed a huge sigh of relief as the first of the returning Doolan dragons signalled their arrival through the dark skies by blowing enormous flames.
"Save your flames!" shouted Dementia excitedly. "You are going to need every last drop of firepower very soon."
Having arrived at the outskirts of the land of the lonely, Trezon began the 2-minute flight towards the town centre. It was dead quiet, and not a single light source was burning. This was exactly the way he wanted it to be. He was relying on the element of surprise. Even the town centre was pitch black and deathly quiet. Trezon sounded his arrival from high in the sky by getting Evuli to indiscriminately shoot out thousands of soccer ball-sized fireballs. He laughed loudly as houses and trees all over the place caught alight. However, not a single creature emerged from the burning houses. He had expected to see panic-stricken, half-asleep creatures scuttling around like frightened rats.
"Come out and face me, you cowards!"
he screamed, then produced an even more intense wave of fireballs, this time the size of beach balls. Almost every single house and tree was now ablaze. Only a handful of both escaped the onslaught and remained unblemished. One such structure was the enormous orphanage. The fireballs literally curved around it as its magic repelled them and modified their courses. Despite the carnage and raging infernos, not one of the friendlies or their allies emerged from their smouldering houses. Trezon nervously rubbed on top of his Flexenbird's head with its feathery right wing. He was totally perplexed.
"What in the blazes is going on?"
he screamed. Dementia and his crew had expected this attack and had a surprise of their own in store.
"Attack!"
shouted Dementia. Frother and his squadron of Doolan dragons suddenly arose from the east. Flambe and his squadron of Doolan dragons suddenly arose from the west. They headed straight towards Trezon. All of the Doolan dragons had volcanic rocks in their nostrils. Their Burlian Dragon Slayer passengers' arrowheads had also been preheated with volcanic rock. Under the command of Dementia, the Sugar Fairies and Soul Wizards who had come to assist suddenly arose from the north. They had been hiding behind the crude shantytown wrecks that the Unfriendlies once called home. Dementia stood between Willowwood and his nephew Zula. Willowwood's golden heart was thumping at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Magica stood beside her older sisters Honeypop and Twinkledust, and her new friend, Wandina. From the south, Sked and his regiments of Koolaboos and Lentinas suddenly appeared from behind the cover of the huge orphanage building. They wheeled out 5 large mechanical catapults and buckets of boiling hot volcanic rocks. Next to Sked stood Fluffle and Hildegard. Trezon had no idea which way to turn. The Burlian Dragon Slayers shot thousands of burning hot arrows at him. They easily burnt away his Flexen form and started to heat up his tainted soul. At this stage, his soul appeared as little more than a very faint red outline. The boiling catapult propelled rocks then, also hitting their target and causing the dim red outline to thicken and begin glowing. It was not yet glowing sufficiently, though, because his memorial diamond could not be seen. In response to these counterattacks, Trezon furiously instructed Evuli to shoot fireballs the size of hot air balloons. The Soul Wizards and Sugar Fairies used their combined magical powers to counteract the destructive force of these enormous fireballs. Some were redirected and crashed well before their target. Others were turned to water and jelly. Dementia even managed to make a few turn to massive piles of feathers. Unfortunately, many of these colossal fireballs got through unscathed and hit their targets. It was very sad to see a few large Doolan dragons and their Burlian Dragon Slayer passengers come crashing to the ground like fiery meteors. Led by Fluffle and Hildegard, Koolaboos and Lentinas fearlessly negotiated their way through a battlefield strewn with fire, water, jelly and feathers to reach their fallen comrades. They all desperately tried to extinguish the flames using little more than buckets of water and sand. Totally exposed, many of these brave creatures also lost their lives. A number of Sugar Fairies were also turned to ashes whilst waving their wands bravely and yelling out commands. Several of the wizards also took direct hits. Fortunately for them, all they lost were their rubbery forms. The heat was not sufficient to make their souls glow. Although the Alliance were taking some casualties, they were also inflicting serious damage on Trezon. The Doolan dragons that survived were now in close enough range to start blowing a solid, continuous wall of flame at Trezon. Their Dragon Slayer passengers had to shield their faces and close their eyes because the radiant heat was so intense. Trezon screamed out in agony as his soul's outline began to glow like a fluorescent red beacon. His memorial diamond suddenly revealed itself. Although bright and sparkly, it also had speckles of black, as if infected by some cancerous growth. Trezon's glowing soul screamed out one last desperate command to Evuli, and it suddenly started to pour down with rain. The Doolan dragons fought furiously to keep Trezon's soul glowing against the cooling effects of the rain. It was a classic battle of water versus fire. Whilst the rain fell relentlessly and showed no signs of stopping, the Doolan dragons were starting to run out of puff. All except one. Frother had been flameless for most of his life. There was no way a little rain was going to dampen his spirit. He continued to blow wave after wave of fire at Trezon's exposed soul. Suddenly, Trezon's soul turned evilly towards Frother and smashed him with an invisible power wave. Frother and his Dragon Slayer passenger went spinning out of control towards the ground. A loud splat could be heard as Frother's enormous frame collided with one of the only remaining huge blobs of jelly. Most had already been liquefied as a result of the surrounding heat. The soft jelly went flying in all directions. Unfortunately, so did Frother's dragon slayer passenger, Sledemus. Frother lay motionless but breathing, head first in the jelly. Sledemus was not quite so lucky. His mangled body lay completely limp on the hard ground 15 meters away. His limbs started to stiffen as rigor mortis set in. Sledemus had taken his last flight, and his last breath. It took the combined efforts of 60 Lentinas to roll Frother out of the jelly so as to prevent him from choking or suffocating. 1, 2, 3, heave! Shouted Hildegard desperately. The combined might of their 60 industrial strength spring-like spines did the job. Frother grimaced with pain as the large cuts and abrasions made contact with the hard turf below. The Lentinas were delighted to hear these grimaces because it meant that Frother was conscious. What happened? He cried out, still semi-dazed and in a severe state of shock. Where's Sledemus? With their primary fire producer now out of commission, things were looking decidedly grim for the Allies. The glow of Trazon's soul was starting to diminish, and the memorial diamond was rapidly fading from view. Trazon's soul arrogantly descended from the sky and made its way towards the helpless Frother. The tyrant was planning to finish Frother off because he knew that this would be an enormously demoralizing blow to the Allies. Instead of scattering, the 60 Lentinas all corralled around Frother to form a continuous blue, shimmering, scaled, protective shield. Not a single one of them considered their own personal safety. Suddenly, and without warning, Trazon's soul stopped its forward advance and turned around sharply, in response to a loud, spine-tingling shriek. It was Sked. With his head concealed in his chest cavity and his arms flailing wildly, the brave Ryboltian spun his way towards Trazon like an enormous spinning top, like a mini tornado. Whilst Sked knew that the intense heat of Trazon's glowing soul would incinerate him, he was more than happy to accept this painful death if it meant also dislodging Trazon's memorial diamond from his glowing soul in the process. He was about to sacrifice his life for the greater cause.
Please don't do it, Sked!
Screamed Fluffle.
We don't want you to die! We love you!
His fast-paced, high-pitched helium voice was drowned away by the sounds of the falling rain and the sizzling steam created by the thousands of fires that were being snuffed out. Tears of sorrow also welled up in Hildegard's bulging eyes. "Please, Sked!" she cried beseechingly, in her slow, dry, twangy voice, and set chase after the gentle giant who had saved her and Fluffle's lives. "We will find another way to destroy Trazon!" Hildegard's running style was not designed for speed, though. Her extremely convexly arched back made it look like she was going backwards with every step she took forwards. There was no way she was going to catch up with him in time, even if Sked were to trip several times. This temporary distraction was just the opportunity that Willowwood had been waiting for. He pulled back with all his might on his powerfully elasticized slingshot and let go. The metallic ball that it released was about the size of an apricot and as smooth as a well-polished ball bearing. It went flying through the air with enormous speed and power. "Die, Trazon!" screamed Willowwood, as the metallic ball made perfect impact with Trazon's memorial diamond and sent it hurtling out of the evil soul wizard's glowing soul and towards the advancing Sked. One of Sked's wildly swinging baseball bat-like forearms made impact with the memorial diamond and sent it hurtling more than 80 meters through the air. It went smashing through the orphanage's huge top-story window pane.
"Home run!"
smiled Dementia. He had been studying Earth culture in anticipation of Alex's visit, and had obviously taken a shining to baseball. Trazon's soul went up in a puff of smoke, along with a Vuli. At that very moment, Willowwood's golden heart medallion stopped beating. The battle was over. This evil villain had finally been destroyed. The Elkwoodian elf king could finally rest easy. Justice had been served. Although the Elkwoodian elf bloodline would still end when he eventually died, he now at least felt that their proud name had been avenged. He hoped that his actions would ensure that they would now be remembered in the annals of history. He could see the entry. It was the young Elkwoodian elf king, Willowwood, who inflicted the fatal blow on Trezon. His species may have gone, but they will never be forgotten. Dementia was ever so proud of Willowwood. He placed the young boy onto his shoulders and danced wildly.
"Long live King Willowwood!"
he cried. The other allies joined in the chorus. Long live King Willowwood! The Doolan dragon's hunger pains had also suddenly subsided. The horrible burning sensation that they'd all felt constantly tug at their tummies was no longer present. The relief showed on their faces. They could finally eat to live rather than living to eat. They could finally get on with their lives. The Burlean dragon slayers embraced their Doolan dragon compatriots and swore to never hunt them again. They would change their name to the Burlean Ironworkers and dedicate the rest of their lives to making some of the most amazing metalwork ever produced. Although Frother had taken such an awful fall from the sky, he had survived fairly unscathed, thanks largely to the jelly cushioning his blow. He still had mild concussion and several nasty cuts and abrasions, but at least he would live to see another day. Sadly, his dragon slayer passenger, Sledemus, would not. Frother delicately picked Sledemus up and gently closed his eyelids. Rest easy, my brave friend, he cried. Large teardrops sizzled as they rolled down his oven-hot cheeks. The battlefield was scattered with many who had fallen in this quest for freedom and hope. Several Doolan dragons and their Burlean dragon slayer passengers could still be seen smouldering under the falling rain. Small piles of ash represented the spots where both Lentinas and Koolaboos had been completely incinerated. Their ashes slowly penetrated deep into the soil and would provide it with richness for future crops. Dementia put his new tear ducts to work and had a long overdue cry. He wept like a baby for over 20 minutes. His tears were stained with both sorrow and joy. Sorrow for the deceased and their loved ones, and joy for the exciting future that now lay ahead. Each new tear cleansed his soul and revitalized his resolve to never allow an evil force to become so powerful again. When the rains finally stopped and the sun began to rise, 23 magnificent rainbows suddenly appeared. Each represented a fallen sugar fairy. The rainbows washed away the sadness and filled everyone's hearts with hope. A new optimistic dawn was now in sight. Dementia blew into the beautiful Hundundi horn with all his might. Its sound easily travelled the 10 kilometres to the green pastures where the friendlies had been requested to take shelter the night before. Its high-pitched echo filled the friendlies' hearts with overwhelming joy, for it signified that the battle was over and that Trezon had finally been defeated. They could now return safely and start to rebuild their lives. Their burnt-down houses would soon be replaced. They would also help build many additional houses for their wonderful new neighbours, the Koolaboos and Lentinas. Harry was also awoken from his deep sleep by the Hundundi horn's incredibly loud resonance. He felt slightly groggy but also totally psyched. Today was the big day. It was the day he got to stand side by side his companions as they fought with courage and bravery to defeat the evil Trezon. The anticipatory excitement had been too much for him to handle the night before, and consequently, he had struggled to fall asleep until the very early hours of the morning. He had tried counting flies, but this didn't work. He had tried spinning thick webs over his bedroom windows to darken the room, but this didn't work either. So he gave up on sleep and spent the next few hours creating body armour for himself using a pile of discarded Lentina scales that he had painstakingly collected the day before. He finally fell asleep at 4 a.m. and failed to hear the 4:30 a.m. call for all present to assume their positions on the battlefield. He was so tired by now that even the noise of the battle failed to stir him. It did not help that his buttonhole ears were not very good amplifiers of sound. It was a huge miracle that not a single one of Trezon's fireballs hit the humble abode in which he was sleeping. All the houses around him were burnt to the ground. Hairy stretched his 30 limbs, ate a few insects for breakfast, and then put on his lentina scale armour. He said a quick prayer to the spider god, and then set off for the battlefield to join the battle that had already been fought and won.
"The battle is already over, Hairy," smiled Magica. "You slept through the entire thing, lazy bones."
It's not possible, screamed Hairy. I just want one swing at Toison, please! Just one swing!
As the friendlies appeared from over the horizon, a little girl with an unusual knock-kneed running style and statically charged luminous pink hair came running towards Willowwood. It was Violina, the Elkwoodian elf girl who'd gone missing all those years ago.
Your Majesty!
She screamed with enormous excitement as she spotted Willowwood's statically charged luminous green hair. Willowwood was overcome with emotion.
Violina!
He screamed and hurriedly ran towards her. As their hands touched, he swept her off her feet and gave her an enormous embrace. He was no longer the last of the Elkwoodian elves. He now had a future mating partner. He now had a future queen. A very hot future queen. The Elkwoodian elf bloodline now had a really good chance of survival.
How? When? Where?
He exclaimed excitedly. Violina bravely filled in all the painful gaps. The late Trazon had abducted her all those years ago in the hope that her disappearance would cause the gentle-natured Elkwoodian elves to suspect their even gentler-natured Gulfybob neighbours of foul play. He was certain his plan would work because the Gulfybobs were the only neighbour of the Elkwoodian elves within a 100-mile radius. He even scattered several items of Violina's clothing deep into Gulfybob territory in an attempt to frame them. Trazon loathed both of these goody-two-shoes tribes and would have loved to seen them at each other's throats. His ploy failed dismally, though. Her disappearance only served to bring the two tribes closer together. The empathic Gulfybobs kindly sacrificed hundreds of hours also searching for Violina. Trazon was bitterly disappointed, but decided nevertheless to keep Violina as a permanent prisoner until such time as he decided what to do with her. He used a strong spell to cryogenically freeze her and then hid her in a remote cave deep in Tishy Gnome territory. Due to other distractions, he then completely forgot about her. And over the years, thin layers of delicate trebulon crystals had grown around her frozen, motionless body. The very moment that Trazon died, the strong spell that had kept Violina frozen for all of those years was broken. Her eyes started to move. Her heart began to pound. Her diaphragm began to inflate and deflate, and her muscles began to twitch. The outwards pressure exerted by these body movements caused the delicate crystal surrounding her to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Despite still being pitch dark and her muscles fairly atrophied, Violina immediately left the cave and started her long journey back towards her beloved Elkwoodian territory. After about an hour of tiresome running, walking, and dragging herself along the ground, she fortuitously stumbled upon thousands of camping friendlies at the outskirts of the Land of the Lonely. They provided her with food and shelter and filled her in on recent events. She was devastated to hear that her entire tribe, with the exception of Prince, now King, Willowwood, had been decimated. She cried for her tribe, her parents, her siblings, and herself. Willowwood was very taken aback by her sad tale. He swore to protect her and make her happy for the rest of her life. Violina raised her shoulders proudly.
I will be strong from this point onwards, because the future of the Elkwoodian elves now depends on you and me.
Yes, indeed, blushed Willowwood.
For behind every great Elkwoodian king stands a great Elkwoodian queen, smiled Violina.
Yes, indeed, blushed Willowwood. He was in love.